I'm Ethan, 34, a systems analyst who plans everything twice because I like surprises to land clean. Our anniversary was the next day, but I stopped by Madison's apartment a day early because I'd finally tracked down a small frame print from a street artist she loved, and I wanted to leave it somewhere. She'd see it when she got home. I let myself in with the spare key she insisted I keep, set my shoes by the door, and noticed her laptop open on the kitchen counter. I assumed she'd stepped out for coffee. I told myself I'd wait, drop the gift, and leave without ruining the surprise. The apartment was quiet except for voices drifting from the laptop, bright and excited, overlapping in that way people get when they're plotting something together. I wasn't trying to listen at first. I was standing there with the print tucked under my arm, staring at the condensation ring on the counter, when Madison's voice cut through the others, sharp with focus. She said she needed it to look authentic, not staged, like a spontaneous moment that just happened to be captured from the perfect angle. Someone laughed and said they'd tested the lighting at the restaurant already, that the corner booth had the cleanest sight line for a phone on a tripod without staff noticing. I froze. The word restaurant made my stomach tighten. Another voice, one of her friends, said they'd coordinate who sat where so no one blocked the shot, and that the server had been tipped in advance to pace the courses. Madison chimed in again, excited, saying the timing mattered, that it had to happen right after dessert, so people were already watching. That public spaces created pressure, and that pressure was the point. Someone asked what if he didn't do it. Madison laughed, not nervous, not uncertain, but amused. She said he would. That guys like him always did when they felt put on the spot. They said my name then, casual, like it was a prop. I heard myself described as safe, predictable, a good sport. Madison said I'd been hinting for months, which was news to me, and that it was only a matter of time before I pulled out a ring. She said she wanted to make it memorable, viral if possible, and that a clean rejection would teach me something. One friend asked if that was cruel. Madison replied that it was strategic, that humiliation now would push me to try harder later, to upgrade the ring, to prove I could do better. She said people respected men who bounced back from rejection with money. They discussed camera angles like engineers, debating whether vertical or horizontal would travel better, whether a reaction shot from behind me would capture my face without showing my hand shaking. Someone suggested a backup phone, in case the first died. Madison said to make sure the clip caught her saying no clearly, gently but firmly, with a line she practiced about timing and growth. She wanted comments debating her bravery. She wanted sympathy, without looking like the villain. She wanted me small in the frame. I stood there holding that gift, my ears ringing, my heart slowing into something heavy and methodical. Every sentence peeled back a layer I didn't know existed, revealing a version of my relationship I hadn't agreed to be in. I realized they weren't planning a moment. They were engineering leverage. I wasn't a partner. I was a variable to be manipulated in public, so the internet could do the rest. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I didn't make a sound. I listened until the call ended and the screen went dark, until the apartment returned to silence and the air felt thinner. I set the framed print back into the bag, wiped the condensation ring from the counter like I'd never been there, locked the door behind me, and carried the weight of what I'd heard down the stairs without dropping it. I stayed standing there longer than I should have, not because I wanted to hear more, but because my body didn't know how to move yet. The call had ended, but the last few minutes kept replaying in my head, looping with new details snapping into focus. Once I understood what they were planning, the earlier parts of the conversation rewired themselves into something uglier. This wasn't casual venting or nervous joking. This was a strategy meeting. Madison's friends weren't shy once they thought the audience was safe. One of them, the one who'd been bragging earlier about brand deals and follower growth, said this could be huge if it was edited right, that audiences loved authentic male disappointment, that vulnerability tested well when it was unscripted on one side only. She talked about framing it as a lesson in standards, about how rejecting a man publicly showed strength and self-worth. Another voice, colder and sharper, the corporate lawyer friend I'd met twice at dinners, laughed and said it was basic leverage, that men responded to incentives and consequences, and that embarrassment was a consequence that stuck. They talked about my job like it was a spreadsheet cell. My income was discussed openly, compared to benchmarks, to what Madison deserved, to what other men supposedly offered. Someone said I made good money for a technical guy, but not ring money. Not yet. And Madison agreed, saying I was comfortable, not impressive. They joked about how I always planned things carefully, how predictable that made me, how easy it would be to steer me into the right restaurant on the right night. One of them mentioned the ring, the family heirloom I'd once shown Madison when we talked about values and history, and they laughed at it, called it sentimental cosplay, said it was sweet in a childish way, but useless for optics. What hit me hardest wasn't the mockery, it was the language. They called it empowerment. They said this was Madison taking control of her narrative, setting expectations, forcing growth. They framed manipulation as self-respect and cruelty as clarity. The influencer friend said Madison shouldn't worry about my feelings because men benefited from rejection. That pain was a motivator, that if I really cared I'd come back with something bigger and shinier. The lawyer said that public rejection protected Madison legally and socially, that witnesses mattered, that if I reacted badly the footage would define me forever, and if I didn't react at all the silence would still read as guilt or inadequacy. At some point I realized they weren't even talking about me anymore, not as a person. I was a role. I was the before picture. I was raw material for a clip that could be cut, captioned, monetized, and forgotten once it stopped performing. Madison nodded along, adding details, talking about how she practiced her tone in the mirror, how she needed to look calm and compassionate while saying no so the comments would side with her. She said she loved me, but love didn't mean settling, and if this pushed me to level up, then everyone won. Standing there, invisible in an apartment I'd helped furnish emotionally if not financially, something settled into place. I understood with absolute clarity that I wasn't her partner in this relationship. I was content. I was a storyline they felt entitled to use because I'd been kind, consistent. In private, the thought wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet, almost clinical, like a diagnosis finally explained symptoms I'd ignored. By the time I left, my hands weren't shaking anymore. The hurt was there, heavy and real, but underneath it was something steadier. They had a plan, and now so did I. Even if all it consisted of at that moment was the certainty that whatever came next would not be on their terms. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat on the edge of my bed with the city glow leaking through the blinds and took the small wooden box out of my dresser, the one I'd moved with me through 3 apartments without ever unpacking properly. The hinge creaked the same way it always had, a dry, familiar sound, and inside was my grandmother's engagement ring resting on the faded velvet like it had been waiting patiently all these years. It wasn't large. It wasn't flashy. The stone was modest and the band thin, worn smooth by decades of being taken off and put back on by hands that had cooked, cleaned, worked, and held on through things that never made it on anyone's camera. I turned it slowly between my fingers and thought about where it came from. My grandfather had proposed in a kitchen, not a restaurant, with no audience except my grandmother and the radio playing softly in the background. They'd stayed married for 56 years. No viral moments, no curated images, no comment section weighing in on whether the ring was good enough. Just 2 people who chose each other daily and never treated love like a transaction or a test. Growing up, that ring was never framed as proof of status. It was proof of commitment, of trust built quietly when no one was watching. I'd imagined giving it to Madison someday, not as a spectacle, but as a conversation, an explanation of why it mattered to me, why I believed meaning outlasted optics. Sitting there alone, the contrast between those values and what I'd overheard earlier felt almost absurd. On one side was love as performance, measured in angles, lighting, and engagement metrics, where humiliation was reframed as growth and manipulation as empowerment. On the other was love as privacy, as protection, as something that didn't need witnesses to be real. I realized then that the ring wasn't just something she'd never see physically. She'd never see what it represented. She'd never understand a version of love that didn't require an audience to validate it or pressure to sustain it. That understanding didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. I closed the box gently and slid it back into the drawer, not with regret, but with a sense of preservation, like returning something valuable to a safe place before a storm. I didn't feel the urge to confront her, to demand explanations, to expose what I knew. Confrontation would only turn me into another reaction shot, another clip that could be reframed and repurposed. Silence, I realized, was the only thing she hadn't planned for. If Madison wanted a performance, she would get one, but not the one she and her friends had rehearsed so carefully. There would be no advance warning, no emotional negotiations beforehand, no chance for her to adjust the script. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling until my breathing evened out and the weight in my chest settled into resolve. Whatever came next would be deliberate. It would be calm. It would be final. And it would honor the kind of love that never needed a camera to exist. I arrived early, exactly on time in the way people who don't want surprises always do. And the moment I stepped into the restaurant, I knew I hadn't imagined anything. The place was upscale in that deliberately dim, carefully curated way, all warm wood, low lighting, and quiet luxury, meant to feel intimate, while still being visible. As I waited near the host stand, my eyes adjusted and the room resolved into a pattern that felt rehearsed. Madison's friends were already there, scattered just far enough apart to look incidental, clustered around small tables they hadn't ordered from yet. Drinks untouched, bodies angled wrong for people who were actually dining. One of them pretended to scroll through her phone, but kept lifting it slightly, adjusting the tilt, checking reflections in the window behind me. Another sat with his back straight and rigid, hands folded, eyes flicking up every few seconds like he was counting beats. In the corner, partially obscured by a decorative plant, I spotted a larger camera bag resting against a chair, unzipped just enough to confirm it wasn't a coincidence. The realization didn't spike my heart rate. It flattened it. This wasn't a dinner. It was a set. I was led to our table, the one I already recognized from their planning, positioned just off-center, visible from multiple angles without being too obvious. I sat down, folded my napkin, and waited. When Madison walked in, she didn't look surprised to see me there early. She looked ready. Her outfit was polished in a way she didn't usually bother with for anniversaries, hairstyled to survive close-ups, makeup done heavier but blended for soft lighting. She smiled with intention, the kind meant to read as warmth on camera, and kissed my cheek just long enough to be noticed. From the start, the conversation followed a rhythm that felt memorized. She talked about how far we'd come, about milestones, about being proud of herself for knowing what she wanted. She steered every topic back toward commitment and expectations, using phrases I'd never heard her say before, but had heard echoed earlier in the voices on that laptop. Growth, standards, clarity. She spoke calmly, carefully, pausing in ways that felt designed to allow reactions, glances, cutaways. I noticed how often her eyes flicked past me, not meeting mine, but checking angles, tracking where attention might be. Every time a server approached, she subtly shifted in her seat, adjusting posture, making sure her profile was visible. Around us, phones were angled just enough to capture reflections in silverware, in wine glasses, in the mirrored wall behind the bar. No one was subtle. They didn't need to be. They were confident I wouldn't see it, or wouldn't act if I did. As the courses came and went, the tension in the room thickened, not with romance, but with anticipation. Madison's voice softened as she talked about the future, about knowing when something was right, about how public accountability mattered. She reached across the table and rested her hand near mine, not touching, just close enough to suggest intimacy, without committing to it. The script was clear. The cue was coming. Sitting there, surrounded by people pretending not to watch, I understood the scale of it. Everyone had a role. The influencer with the best angle. The lawyer ready to narrate the morality afterward. The friends positioned as witnesses. The staff unwittingly facilitating pacing. Madison at the center, composed and radiant, waiting for her moment. And me, cast as the catalyst, expected to trigger the scene they'd already edited in their heads. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and let the noise fade into the background. The restaurant was full of actors, but for the first time that night, I wasn't one of them. The moment arrived the way they had engineered it to, sliding into place after dessert, like a trap, snapping shut. Madison took a breath that was just a little too theatrical, glanced around the room, as if grounding herself, and then reached into her purse. I could feel the collective lean of the restaurant, the sudden hush that comes when strangers sense they're about to be given something to watch. Phones rose higher. The hidden camera whirred. Softly, Madison placed a small box on the table between us and opened it with a practiced flourish. Inside was a ring I had never seen before, cheap in a way that tried to imitate elegance, the stone catching the light too aggressively, the band too thick for the size. She stared at it for half a second, long enough for the cameras to lock focus, then pushed the box back toward me and stood up. Her voice carried, clear and controlled, rehearsed to sound wounded without sounding weak. She said she couldn't accept this, that it showed a lack of effort, a lack of understanding of her worth. She said she deserved more than sentiment, more than someone who didn't value her enough to invest properly. Each line landed exactly where it was supposed to, like she was hitting marks on a stage. The restaurant went silent in that unnatural way that only happens when people realize they're part of a scene they didn't consent to. Forks paused midair. A server froze near the bar. Madison's friends leaned in, eyes bright, phone steady, already imagining captions. She waited for me to reach for the box, for the scramble, for the flush of shame, for the apology that would make the clip complete. I didn't move. I didn't touch the ring. I looked at it for a moment, then up at her, and then around the room, making sure my voice would carry without rising. I said calmly that the ring wasn't mine, that I had never seen it before in my life. The stillness sharpened, confusion rippling outward as people recalibrated. Madison's smile flickered for the first time, just a hairline crack, but she recovered quickly, shaking her head like I was deflecting. I continued, evenly, explaining that I hadn't brought a ring tonight, that I hadn't planned a proposal, that whatever was sitting in that box didn't belong to me. I could feel the cameras struggling to adjust to a narrative they hadn't prepared for, lenses shifting, hands tightening. Madison opened her mouth to interrupt, but I spoke over her without raising my voice, not angry, just precise. I said that if she was rejecting something, it should at least be something I'd given her. Then I asked it, plainly, without venom or theatrics, the way you'd ask about a misplaced wallet or a forgotten coat, whether she had bought that ring herself just so she could reject me in public. The words hung there, heavy and unavoidable. A few people gasped. Someone laughed nervously and then stopped. Madison's face drained of color as the script collapsed in real time, her eyes darting toward her friends, toward the phones, toward anything that could tell her what to do next. No one moved. No one spoke. The cameras kept rolling, but the energy had shifted, the performance drained of its power. For the first time all night, there was no angle that could save her, no edit that could turn the moment back into what she'd planned. I sat there, hands folded on the table, while the truth did what it always does when it's finally said out loud, and watched a room full of actors realize they were no longer in control of the scene. For a few seconds after my words landed, nothing happened, like the entire room had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. Madison's mouth opened and closed without sound, her composure evaporating in small, visible fractures. Her eyes were wide now, not luminous for the camera, but darting, searching faces, searching for a cue that wasn't coming around us. Her friends were frozen mid-act, phones still raised but no longer confident, their expressions caught between disbelief and calculation as they realized the narrative had slipped completely out of their hands. I didn't rush. I didn't gloat. I let the silence do its work before I spoke again, because silence was the one thing they hadn't planned for. When I did speak, my voice stayed level, carrying easily through the room that was now paying attention for the wrong reasons. I said that earlier that week, I'd overheard a video call in Madison's apartment, that it hadn't been private at all, and that I'd listened long enough to understand exactly what tonight was supposed to be. I explained that the rejection wasn't spontaneous, that it had been rehearsed, timed, and staged for maximum visibility. Madison shook her head, trying to interrupt, but I kept going, not louder, just steadier. I said I knew about the phones positioned around the restaurant, the professional camera hidden near the corner, the discussions about angles and lighting and social reach. I said I knew they'd talked about my salary like it was a punchline, weighed against expectations I'd never agreed to, reduced to a number that justified humiliating me in public. A murmur rippled through the room as people began looking around, finally noticing the phones, the bags, the sudden guilt on faces that hadn't expected to be seen. I mentioned the ring my grandmother wore for more than half a century, the one they'd mocked as insufficient and embarrassing because it didn't photograph well. I said that ring represented a marriage built without an audience, without leverage, without shame as a motivational tool, and that it was never meant to be content. Madison's friends avoided eye contact now, hands lowering, screens darkening as the reality of the situation set in. One of them stood halfway, then sat back down, unsure of what role she was supposed to play anymore. When I finished, I turned away from Madison and addressed the restaurant itself, the strangers who'd been unwillingly drafted into someone else's spectacle. I apologized for the disruption, for the discomfort, for turning a shared space into a stage without consent. The apology was sincere, and it landed differently than anything else that night, because it wasn't performative. It wasn't meant to be clipped or shared. It was simply owed. Then I said there would be no proposal. Not tonight, not later, not ever. I said it calmly, not as a threat or a punishment, but as a statement of fact. The future Madison had been trying to manipulate into existence no longer existed. What she had planned to use to break me instead stripped her of all credibility in real time. The empowerment she'd rehearsed collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty, leaving nothing but exposed intent and stunned silence. I stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out without looking back. Behind me, the room erupted into confused noise, whispers, hurried explanations. The sound of plans unraveling. What had been designed to make me beg had done the opposite. It had made the truth unavoidable, and it followed me out into the night like a door closing, final and clean. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through notifications I never opened and links friends sent me with a single line attached. Usually some version of "you might want to see this" by the next morning. The footage was everywhere, but not the way Madison and her friends had planned. It wasn't a tight vertical clip with captions guiding outrage in a convenient direction. It was long, uncut video, shaky in places, brutally clear in others, showing the setup, the fake ring, the pause, my words, and the moment the room turned on the truth, someone had uploaded everything before anyone could spin it. Public opinion moved fast, and it moved hard. The comments weren't debating nuance or tone. They were dissecting intent. People replayed the parts where phones were visible, where Madison glanced toward the cameras, where her friends froze with devices half raised. Others clipped the sections where I talked about the planning, the money, the mockery, and paired it with screenshots from old posts that suddenly read differently in context. The narrative that was supposed to make me look small instead exposed a level of calculation most people instinctively recoiled from. Within days, the influencer friend lost sponsorships one by one. Brands issued bland statements about values and accountability while quietly scrubbing her from campaigns. The lawyer friend locked her accounts, then deleted them entirely after colleagues began asking questions she couldn't reframe as empowerment. Friendships imploded under the pressure of being associated with something so publicly ugly. People distanced themselves fast, like credibility was contagious, and they were afraid of catching the wrong strain. Madison tried to reach me through every channel she could think of. It started with messages that pretended nothing irreversible had happened, that talked about misunderstandings and stress and growth. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted to apologies, long and emotional, promising therapy, reflection, change. Flowers arrived at my door with handwritten notes that used words like clarity and healing the way she'd once used standards and worth. Letters followed, then voicemails I never listened to but deleted without opening, their length alone enough to tell me what they contained. I didn't block her right away. I didn't need to. Reading without responding was enough to confirm what I already knew. None of it addressed the core truth. Not really. The apologies were about consequences, not choices. They mourned what she'd lost, not what she'd done. Even stripped of an audience, the instinct to manage perception was still there, still louder than accountability. Life around me quieted again as the internet found something new to tear apart. The clips kept circulating, but I stopped watching. I went back to work, back to routines that felt grounding precisely because they weren't shareable. The ring stayed in its box, untouched, where it belonged. Every so often someone would mention the story in passing, carefully, like they weren't sure how close to step. I told them I was fine, and I was, in the way that comes from certainty rather than closure. Some things can't be unlearned. You can't unknow how easily someone turns intimacy into leverage or how comfortable they are rehearsing your humiliation for likes. You can't unhear your life reduced to content and strategy. Silence became my boundary, not as punishment, but as self-respect. I didn't know Madison a response, and I didn't need one from her. The truth had already said everything out loud, and it didn't require a reply. Weeks passed before Madison finally showed up in person. Waiting outside my building like proximity might substitute for access. She looked smaller without the audience, stripped of polish, eyes red in a way that might have meant regret, or might have meant exhaustion from consequences finally settling in. She said it was a mistake. She said she'd been influenced. She said her friends had pushed her, that she'd gotten caught up in something she didn't fully understand until it was too late. She used the word accident like it might soften the edges of what she'd done. I listened without interrupting. Not because I owed her that, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain I wasn't walking away from a misunderstanding. When she finished, I told her calmly that it hadn't been a mistake. I said mistakes were unplanned, impulsive, reactive. What she had done was deliberate. It was coordinated. It had a timeline, a strategy, roles assigned, and contingencies discussed. I told her it wasn't an accident. It was a campaign, and campaigns don't happen by slipping once. They happen by choosing an objective and accepting collateral damage. She cried then, real tears this time, not the kind meant to be seen, but it didn't change anything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list every detail again. I just said that the version of her capable of doing that was not someone I could unknow, and trust doesn't regenerate after it's been intentionally spent. I wished her well, not dramatically, not bitterly, just honestly, and asked her not to contact me again. When I walked back inside, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned, like my actions finally matched my values. Life settled into something quieter after that. Not smaller, just clearer. Months later, I met someone new in a way that would have bored an algorithm to death. No filters, no audience, no documentation. She was direct in a way that didn't perform sincerity, just lived it. We talked without scripts. We disagreed without posturing. There was no pressure to escalate for optics, no need to turn private moments into proof. Time moved at a human pace, not a viral one. The ring stayed where it had always been, safe in its box, unchanged by everything that had happened. It wasn't waiting in desperation. It wasn't a symbol of what I'd lost. It was simply preserved, carrying its meaning intact, untouched by metrics or spectacle. If it ever left that drawer, it would be because it was offered in trust, not extracted by pressure. It would be given to someone who understood that love didn't need witnesses to be real, and that respect wasn't something you earned back after choosing to trade it away. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with closure speeches or final messages. It came with consistency, with silence that protected rather than punished, with a refusal to bargain with someone else's regret. I didn't win anything viral. I didn't need it. I kept something better. I kept my self-respect. And I learned exactly what kind of love I was no longer willing to audition for.